Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at washingtech.com/book. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washingtech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washingtech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Former Attorney General Eric Holder says Ed Snowden performed a public service, tech giants sign a pact with the EU to scrub hate speech, and Joe Torres is my guest. Former Attorney General Eric Holder appeared on CNN and the University of Chicago's X-Files podcast last week, where he told David Axelrod that Ed Snowden performed a, quote, public service by disclosing classified National Security Agency surveillance documents to the public. But the former official said there should be repercussions and that Snowden should pay for what he did. Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and Google have all signed an agreement with the European Union that requires the tech companies to remove hate speech from their platforms or face penalties. EU Commissioner for Justice, Consumers, and Gender Equity, Vera Jourova, said, quote, social media is unfortunately one of the tools that terrorist groups use to radicalize young people and racists use to spread violence and hatred. This agreement is an important step forward to ensure that the internet remains a place of free expression and where European values and laws are respected, end quote. In sworn testimony before the D.C. Circuit District Court, Hillary Clinton's former chief of staff, while she served as Secretary of State Cheryl Mills, said Mrs. Clinton's advisors never intended to evade the Freedom of Information Act by setting up and maintaining ClintonEmail.com, the private email server Clinton relied on exclusively when she was serving as Secretary of State. Mills said many staffers knew about the ClintonEmail.com domain and communicated with Clinton on it regularly. Mills said Clinton never intended to use the State Department's email server, as she used a private email account while she served as senator, and this was regarded as simply being a continuation of that. The New York Times has more. The Washington Post reported that the State Department has admitted to posting to its website and YouTube channel doctored videos of a December 2013 press briefing. The backstory here is that back in February of 2013, Rosen asked then State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland whether the U.S. government was engaged in secret bilateral negotiations with Iran. Nuland denied that, but then it turned out later on that there were secret negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. So Rosen followed up in December of that same year, asking then spokeswoman Jen Psaki whether the State Department made it a practice to lie in order to preserve secret negotiations. But on the videos posted to the State Department's website, the question and answer was replaced by a flash of white light, but no one knows who ordered the question and answer to be removed. Pretty creepy. Check out the Post's full coverage. The Guardian reported last week that sources tell it Facebook is planning to encrypt its Messenger app. The move would come amid the Justice Department's crackdown on tech companies like Apple, as well as apps like WhatsApp, that encrypt data and text messages, making it impossible for law enforcement officials to execute warrants for user information. The Guardian reports an encrypted Messenger app would be opt-in, much like Google's new Allo messaging app, which is expected to hit app stores this summer. The Wall Street Journal reported last week that Chinese tech giant Xiaomi is going to buy 1,500 patents from Microsoft. The move is considered to be an indication that Xiaomi is considering offering its devices outside of developing countries. Marguerite Reardon at CNET reported last week on the different arguments both sides are advancing in the debate about how much the FCC should regulate how ISPs treat consumer data. The crux of the conflict is that people who oppose the FCC proposed privacy rules say the FTC already has a set of privacy rules that apply to tech companies, and that yet another set of rules that apply only to ISPs would be too confusing. But groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and Public Knowledge are saying that that ISPs wanting to enter the advertising market dominated by Google and Facebook is precisely the problem, because ISPs basically want to continue to exploit user data to gain insights into how to compete more effectively. Again, that's over at CNET. The Wall Street Journal reported last week that the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology has launched an investigation of a cyber heist of $101 million from the Bangladeshi Central Bank's account with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that took place earlier this year. The long-awaited Spectrum auction opened up last week. The auction is designed to free up broadcast spectrum for wireless and compensate broadcasters that hold the existing spectrum. Deborah McAdams has a full explanation of how the incentive auction process is going to work over at tvtechnology.com. FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler wrote to members of Congress last week telling them the rules the FCC proposed to open up the set-top box market will lead to more programming diversity. He said the current video ecosystem is not conducive to promoting minority-owned content and channels because even though popular cable packages offer between 200 and 500 channels, only 2 of the channels are Hispanic-owned and 4 are African-American owned. Wheeler also wrote that the channels also don't get the financial support they need, while other channels like ESPN just get it handed to them. Cable providers currently pay over $7 per month per subscriber to ESPN, according to Wheeler, whether those subscribers watch ESPN or not. So for ESPN, their access to capital comes baked in. Must be nice. 55 lawmakers, mostly Republicans, had asked Wheeler back in April to delay the set-top box proceeding and conduct a study first to determine how the proposed rules would affect the market. John Brodkin at Ars Technica did a nice write-up on this last week if you're interested in learning more. Finally, in a 12-3 opinion, the Fourth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals ruled last week that law enforcement officials do not need a warrant to obtain cell phone location data from suspects. This overturns the 2015 ruling of the court's 3-judge panel. The case stems from a police investigation in Baltimore of a string of robberies in which police obtained cell phone location data from Sprint, which led to the convictions of Aaron Graham and Eric Jordan. Stay with us. For Washington Tech Policy Podcast listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. Why not Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance by Angela Duckworth? You can download Grit free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at washingtech.com/book. My guest today is Joe Torres, Senior External Affairs Director at Free Press. Joe advocates in Washington to ensure that our nation's media policies serve the public interest and builds coalitions to broaden the movement's base. Joseph writes frequently on media and internet issues and is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. He is the 2015 recipient of the Everett C. Award, which recognizes an individual whose work embodies the principles and values of the public interest. Please welcome Joe Torres. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Today we're going to talk about media ownership diversity. Last year, the FCC passed net neutrality rules that reclassify broadband providers as common carriers, bringing the internet within the scope of the FCC's authority. On that basis, the rules provide that wired and wireless ISPs can't engage in throttling, paid prioritization, or discrimination against web traffic. The tech sector and free speech advocates support the rules, but they are opposed by the cable and wireless industries. In fact, these companies have sued the FCC to have the rules overturned, and we're waiting for the court's decision as we speak. But these are rules that pertain to the internet, you say. What do they have to do with media ownership diversity? Well, media ownership diversity has been going on for a long time. The debate's been going on for a long time. For electronic media alone, TV and radio, we're talking about a debate that's been going on for 9 full decades with statistically zero media ownership diversity to show for it. Well, the internet has opened the door to new voices, of course, and it has extremely low barriers to entry compared to traditional media. And the net neutrality rules help ensure ISPs that want to prioritize their own content can't do so by degrading yours. Joe Torres co-wrote a book about the history of diversity in media and journalism along with Juan Gonzalez called News for All the People. And he's going to show us how history has shaped where we are today when it comes to media policy. So, Joe, it's a privilege having you on the show.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
So, Joe, your book was released back in 2011, so 5 years ago, but history doesn't change. So can you summarize for us some of the major threats to media diversity that have been going on before your book was published and since?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on again. You know, the way I look at this, the history of media in our country was created at a time when people of color were either slaves, Native Americans were being run off from their lands and considered barbarous. The media system was created at a time in our country when obviously overt racism, racist government policies, treating people of color as threats to society were a part of a white supremacy culture, policy making within our country of white supremacy in order for the labor of others to be used in order to create wealth for a white population, right? So the history of white supremacy and the media system goes hand in hand, and the history of racism and goes hand in hand as well. So when media systems have been created through the decades, through the centuries, we were naturally excluded from that. Because we weren't in a position of any kind of power to be able to take advantage of the creation of new media systems, particularly when technology came along, whether it's the telegraph, radio, television, cable television. We're still grappling with the history of white supremacy and a white racial narrative that has formed through the years, and still trying to combat that. And because of that, because of the history of our country, when it comes to racism, our communities haven't developed the wealth that's necessary to be able to own media properties, whether it is radio stations or TV stations, cable networks, cable systems. And so this is why the fight over the future of the open internet, for what you talked about, the lowest barrier to entry is critically important because it potentially allows people of color to have their own control over their own agency. So this is a fight that continues to replicate itself. I'll just say that, ironically, when the newspapers were first created, the newspaper system, we created the postal system really in this country. One of the main reasons we created the postal system was to help of the delivery of newspapers. Folks the government understood that in order for folks to remain informed as our country continued to expand, through territorial expansion with removal of Native Americans and from their tribal lands, and as we continue to grow into the Southwest, and as we continue to grow as a country, it was critically important that people had access to content and information and news. And so they subsidized the delivery of newspapers, and up to like about 90% of the mail at one time was the delivery of newspapers. It was ironically during this time in our nation's history that people of color were able to actually create their own newspapers and have it delivered and subsidized, because the post office was this decentralized system. It was a decentralized delivery system. And so even though at this time of racism continue to exist, but these policies of fighting, and folks were fighting against slavery, folks were fighting against territorial expansion, people of color were brave enough to still be able to create their own newspapers and have them delivered. At times they weren't delivered to particular parts of the country. They refused to deliver these newspapers, including abolitionist newspapers. But it was a decentralized system where folks were able to have ownership over what they were producing and publishing. And that is the fight we're still having to this day.
What are the dangers of not having enough media outlets owned by minorities and women?
It is the fact of who gets to tell your story. The reason I do the work I do, and a lot of the people who are media advocates do the work we do, is because we're trying to fight to make sure that we can tell our own stories. And those who get to control the narrative are critically important to shaping society. Throughout the history of media, media's played a critical role in working hand in hand often with government in helping to promote racist government policies that disenfranchise, marginalize, supported violence against people of color in order to continue to prop up a white supremacist society, right? So the way in which we have to fight back and challenge those in power is the ability to speak freely and communicate with each other, communicate with our community, and inform them about what's going on. That the original newspapers, whether it's Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper in this country, to these early papers, their role was a dissident role. They were challenging racism in society. They were challenging the institution of slavery. We are still fighting the same fight in the modern day, where we continue to try to speak for ourselves in order to challenge policies in government and societal injustices that continue to be carried out against us. And so those who own media companies, those who own powerful platforms, get to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. Or when they do cover people of color, they do talk about people of color, how do they talk about us? There was a study a few years ago that studied the media market in Pittsburgh to study like how are black folks covered in the local market. And they found when it comes to Black men, 96% of all the stories about Black men were either about crime or sports. So here we have a situation where literally the first colonial newspapers were talking about Native Americans as barbarous Indians, talking about black folks as being a danger to society, addicted to stealing and lying. These were like some of the early colonial papers talking about Black people, to the modern day where Black people are still talked about as a threat to society. The narrative hasn't changed, and the narrative hasn't changed because we lack access to be able to own our own broadcast systems, cable networks, to challenge that narrative. So it's been a white racial narrative that has been it's been the dominant theme when it comes to people of color in this country, and we're still fighting that. This story has not changed, and so those who own media properties get to determine what stories are told, and this is why the fight over the future of the internet is critically important, because of the lower barrier of entries for us to be able to try to challenge this narrative.
Well, if it weren't for your work and organizations like Free Press, I wouldn't be sitting here doing this podcast with you right now. You are complimenting my equipment. That's because of you, man. We were talking offline, and Joe was complimenting my mic and my equipment.
Yeah, and it's like the fact that you have a podcast, or do you have alternative ways in which to get a message out? This is what we're fighting for. I mean, there's still doesn't mean the internet is a level playing field by any stretch of the imagination. It just creates an opportunity for us to potentially intervene in what's going on, but it doesn't guarantee that it's all the injustices that happen in the physical world still are in the virtual world, where lack of access to capital. So a program like yours could get funding, right, to be able to expand and grow. There's still all these challenges that exist in the everyday life in the physical world that exist in the virtual world as well.
But take us back in time, Joe. What were some early examples of minority viewpoints being suppressed, and what are the parallels that we still see today? Ida
B. Wells, right? She had a newspaper that she was editing, and they shut it down because of her advocacy, sticking up for her friends that were killed by mob violence. That is an example. That there's numerous examples of which the press itself, owned by people of color, were shut down by folks who were not happy about what they were printing. So that's examples, or that's an example. Also, the mainstream media often supported lynching. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution were in support of lynching, particularly at the time when lynching was at its height, between like 1890 and 1920, when there was like 3,000 Black Americans who were hung, right? And institutions like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution were in support of this mob violence. I'm reading a book right now about the history of Mexican lynchings. It's something that hasn't been as well documented, but this is really a good book out that he actually went back and started documenting the amount of lynching that was happening with Mexican Americans. And you see all these newspapers that were very much in support of the lynching of Mexican Americans. This is why in recent years, over like a decade ago, there were about 4 or 5 papers that came out and apologized for its role in either not covering the civil rights movement or supporting mob violence. And so the one that Juan and I always talk about the most is the one that happened in North Carolina, where I always pronounce the first name wrong, Giuseppe Daniels. He was a publisher of the News and Observer in Raleigh. He used his paper to help the Democratic Party at the time in the 1890s, 1898, to overthrow local government in Wilmington, North Carolina. That was the majority black city. That was a government that was a fusion government between Republicans and blacks in the city to have a fusion government where they had a progressive agenda of voting rights and economic justice issues, to address issues of economic justice. And he used his paper to instigate the overthrow of the local government in Wilmington, North Carolina, that led to dozens of black folks being killed, black leaders being shipped out by train. It was the first overthrow of a local government in our nation's history. And this Joseph Daniel was a very powerful figure. His son, ironically, years later became the publisher of the paper and used that to support civil rights. But he bragged about it in his autobiography, Josephus Daniels, about what he did. And he became a chief strategist for like Woodrow Wilson and ambassador to Mexico under FDR. He was a powerful figure, but yet he bragged about in his autobiography how he used his paper to incite violence to help with his overthrow by portraying black people as a threat to the physical bodies of white folks. That white folks need to be afraid of black folks will commit all these violent acts. And he also resulted in burning down the black newspaper that was published in that town. So this is an example that folks don't talk about. The News and Observer actually apologized, and I think it was 2006, for the role of this paper in mob violence. But this is stuff that's not really known often when they teach history about the role of newspapers in particular in supporting mob violence. Josephus Daniels was actually he's portrayed in history books as a crusading publisher and editor, but they don't talk about what he did in Wilmington in helping to lead to an overthrow of a local government that was incite violence against the black community in Wilmington, North Carolina. That's like a history that's few know. But and if you think about it today, while things are different today in that sense, but when all this dog whistle politics happening in news coverage, we see it all the time. There's a legitimacy that's lent to saying that people of color, you should be afraid of them. The way they talk about what's happening and how people of color are continued to be covered. How Donald Trump, for instance, is covered, and legitimate. The folks are like looking past his hate speech and legitimizing him as a candidate. It's a different day, but the narrative is still the same.
Yeah, that's why, I want to pivot to the Facebook example. Recently we saw Facebook get into some hot water about alleged bias and how Facebook selects stories that appear in the news feed. Right. And so there's all these fire alarms going off among conservatives that Facebook is suppressing their viewpoints. But we didn't see the same fire alarms going off all these years when Fox News has been doing this. We just, and there have been, it may be pretty, it's hard to establish the exact the exact effect that something that someone says has on inciting violence. But I mean, come on. There's been clear bias on Fox News for many, many years. So I want to get your thoughts on that issue, and then also just the issue of Facebook's role in journalism generally. You know, just to give a little background for it. Let me just do the background first. Some contractors who used to manage Facebook's newsfeed said they actively suppressed conservative news, but the New York Times also weighed in and said Facebook exercises tremendous power in journalism and suggested that power shouldn't be left unchecked. And then John Thune wrote a letter to Facebook saying, concerned that wanting to investigate Facebook's bias in suppressing conservative news. But, you know, again, there wasn't a word in there about what's going on with some of these other traditional media outlets. So I just want to get your thoughts on that, Joe.
You know, I'm really grappling with this issue. I think a lot of us are when it comes to Facebook and Google and the power of these companies to control what we access online, in a sense, particularly when it comes to news. They're powerful platforms, and they're a platform that we use. And Facebook is an example. It's not just a powerful platform in how people access news, and it's also a platform where local law enforcement and government they're interested in. They're using Facebook to also surveil our community. There's a lot of issues here, and clearly the size and dominance of Facebook and Google, it poses a lot of challenges and a lot of threats to how we access content and how content is monetized and folks able to make profit. And what does it mean about the future of journalism? And these are not easy questions to answer. I think I know John Thune sent this letter, and it also runs up against First Amendment issues too, right? They're a private company that's publishing content, or people are self-publishing content. And are they a news? Are they just a platform that people use to self-publish, or are they also in the news? Are they also a media outlet? And this gets debated all the time. And and what I'm really concerned about, and I think about, and I don't have answers to this yet. And this is one of the areas where I think a lot of people don't have answers. But as people of color, we use these platforms to self-publish, to connect with folks, and that's great and everything. The value of Facebook, in a sense, like for myself, like being able to stay connected to my family, which is really the main reason why I stay on Facebook, because aunts and uncles and relatives that you don't see, but you get to see them post video and pictures of your relatives, and so you feel like you stay connected to your family. It's very troubling about like what is the dominance over our ability to access content, and I just don't have an easy answer. It also runs up against First Amendment issues too,
right? Because and that's the double standard, right? Because my thing is that my view is that there's a clear that's a clear First Amendment issue, and for whatever reason Congress is getting a lot more involved with overstepping their bounds when it comes to First Amendment, when their views are suppressed. But minorities, women, Muslims, immigrants, not so much.
Yeah, and how do you tackle this when, to me, this falls more into like antitrust issues. But is antitrust laws adequate, and I'm not a lawyer, so I this is what I hear from my colleagues and stuff who are lawyers, are antitrust laws adequate enough to deal with issues like Google and Facebook? Mm-hmm. Or is the FTC, where this is more likely to play out with issues of consumer issues? And I'm not as familiar how the FTC works as the FCC, but how do you how do you protect the consumer over the market dominance of these big platforms? I'm grappling with it like a lot of other folks, but it is a real threat. Now, the First Amendment issue is with Thune. I mean, I was listening to a podcast upon the media the other day, and they were talking about how Thune talked about in 2007 the First Amendment rights of folks who produce content in the government should be it's not the government place to interfere with First Amendment issues. And so he's asking questions here, right? But it's like there's a First Amendment issue here that he's bumping up against as well. But at the same time, it speaks to potentially if the power of and the biases of algorithms, right? Algorithms are written by human beings who inherently have bias, and so oftentimes, it's not the algorithm. I heard Dana Boyd from Data and Society says not the algorithms that are racist, the outcomes of an algorithm. It is necessarily the algorithm that is the racist. It's the people who are. I'm not phrasing as well as I should, but it's the folks who write the algorithms.
Right. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's there's bias inherent in algorithms because the algorithms have to be created by somebody.
Right. And so these are like important questions that I'm not sure I'm doing a good job of really talking about as well as I could here, but I'm grappling with these issues and what does it mean, particularly when it comes to ownership over our own image and distribution of our own image. The same issues we started talking about, how do they play out in this new online world that's really still fairly new, right? I mean, Facebook and all these companies, Twitter, they've only been around for about a decade or less, and so this is a new world in which we're trying to grapple with because of there's a lot of complex issues within this. So, but there is a First Amendment issue in play, but also there's an antitrust issue potentially in here as well. And how does antitrust laws deal with the dominance of these companies to control the access to the content that we are able to access or that we are watching or reading online? It concerns me. It concerns me greatly.
Well, Joe, it's been an absolute privilege having you on the show. We can't get into every detail of media diversity here because, after all, it's been going on for 9 decades. But, it's just been wonderful having you on the show. But anyone who wants to catch up on the history of media ownership diversity and the debate that's been going on for so long, I encourage you to please check out Joe and Juan Gonzalez's masterpiece, News for All the People. I encourage everyone listening to grab a copy. But Joe, thanks once again for joining me. I just want to ask you a few more questions and then we'll close. Sound like a plan?
Sounds good.
All right. On this podcast, we like to talk about policy and entrepreneurship, but also about what makes successful people like you tick. Tell us, Joe, what are some habits, tactics, and apps that you use every day to stay on top of your game?
I don't use that many apps really. What I listen to a lot is podcasts. So I'm getting into podcasts more. I find it very convenient to be able to keep up with stuff. So, for instance, I recommend everyone subscribe to your podcast. But I listen to Latino USA. I listen to Microphone Check, Alt Latino Radio. I listen to on the media. So I'm getting more and more into listening to podcasts as a way to keep up with what's going on in society. I don't use that many apps, to be quite honest with you. I feel like I use too much video shooting my kid that I'm always like running up against capacity space. So, but my kid has Minecraft. How about that? So that's the app that's most used on my phone. So Minecraft, but I don't use it.
And tell us the name of a book that you read recently that you're recommending to basically everyone you meet.
Well, I'm reading. I got a couple books I'm in the process of reading. One is Dark Matters, which is by Professor Simone Brown out of UT Austin, and looks at the history of surveillance of blackness in the United States. It's an issue of surveillance that I'm working more and more on that's deeply troubling, and the media and surveillance go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. So want to write more about that. And then The Forgotten Dead, I think I mentioned it during the podcast where it's about the history. These professors, this professor looks at goes back and traces the history of lynching of Mexican Americans and just the amount of lynching and mob violence against Mexican Americans doesn't get enough notoriety, or that's probably not the right word, notoriety, but enough coverage, or folks are not as aware as they should be. But it was horrific, the amount of violence toward Mexican Americans, particularly in Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and California. And I'm reading the new Jim Crow. I'm
Great
halfway
book.
through Michelle Alexander's book, and it's hard not to read that book, or any of these books, to be quite honest with you, without feeling angry.
Yeah.
So,
how you doing, man? You taking care of yourself?
I do.
Because as for many years, as you know, working on these issues every day, day in and day out, it really does take a toll to be constantly mired in this stuff.
Within the context of this is all happening within the context, all this fight is about, for me, it's about making sure we have access to a technology that allows us to fight for racial justice. It's not so I can watch the next episode of the Kardashians on my favorite device. It is so Black Lives Matter and immigrant rights and all these other racial justice movements have a chance to change society. In order for us to have more just policies, so our kids have a proper education, or an equitable system in place where our kids can get a quality education and healthcare and all these other issues that our communities suffer from. From a lack of there's a lack of equitable access to all these different institutions. So, I honestly, like, I go home and I like to watch sports. Sports are my escape.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks again, Joe, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with the audience before we close? And where can folks find you online?
Online on Twitter, Joseph A. Torres. On Twitter, that's where my Twitter handle's not good. My Twitter game's not great, but I'm a good retweeter. So I retweet a lot, but definitely check me out. I'm freepress.net, where I write a lot. I often write a lot, so folks can shoot me an email at jtorres@freepress.net.
You've been listening to Joseph Torres, Senior External Affairs Director at Free Press. Joseph advocates in Washington to ensure that our nation's media policies serve the public interest and builds coalitions to broaden the movement's base. Joseph writes frequently on media and internet issues and is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. He's the 2015 recipient of the Everett C. Parker Award, which recognizes an individual whose work embodies the principles and values of the public interest. Joe, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
And that concludes episode 42 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. When you have a chance, hit me up with a rating and review in iTunes. It'll take you 10 seconds, no more. I will see you back here next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.